So thank you to Dominic and to Deakin for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. And what I hope I'll be able to do actually is give you a bit of a case study actually for how you can apply a whole bunch of things that all the speakers today have been talking about into a particular area, and it's quite an interesting and challenging one at that, as we talk about automated and zero-emission vehicles and what that might mean for us in infrastructure sense. Before I get to that, just a bit of context. So Infrastructure Victoria, we are the Victorian Government and Parliament's independent infrastructure advisor. And when we're not providing advice on tricky, complex things like automated and zero-emission vehicles, we also produce a 30-year infrastructure strategy. And so that's where we spend a whole lot of time doing what some of the speakers earlier have been talking about, which is, well, what are the right projects? What are the right policies at the very front end? What are Victoria's infrastructure needs? What are all the options? And at a strategic level, what are the ones that look like the best choice and why? And we spend a lot of our time trying to fix that component of what has already been explained as being, a multifaceted challenge that we all face. So if you're interested in the 30-year infrastructure strategy, we published it for the first time in 2016, and we're in the process of updating it at the moment with the next issue due out next year, so stay tuned for that. We were asked by the Victorian Government to give advice on what infrastructure we would need if you have a really high proportion of automated or zero-emission vehicles in the fleet in Victoria. And so by automated vehicles, for those of you who are AV aficionados, I'm talking levels 4 and 5. So these are highly automated vehicles that you are not going to need to be sticking your hand on the steering wheel in any or in very few circumstances. And by zero-emission vehicles, what I'm talking about really is battery electric vehicles, but also hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. And when we talk zero-emission, we're talking zero-emission at the tailpipe, but importantly for the work that we did, we were looking at zero emission at source of energy generation as well, which is particularly important in a Victorian context, of course, as we've got a transition happening over some time in our energy system and its emissions. And so the question was about not every single thing to do with automated vehicles and electric vehicles. Importantly, what we didn't look at was all the licensing and vehicle regulation stuff, because that's what the National Transport Commission are doing some good work on at the moment. But we were interested in what some of the other elements of it were beyond just what happens on the road. And we were quite interested in, well, what are some of the emerging market models and the way consumers would behave in response to those market models that might come up. What we were also trying to work through is, well, what is the interplay between the land uses and transport system changes, particularly with something like an automated vehicles. And when we've got some uncertainty about how this is going to happen over time, what is a sort of sensible pathway for infrastructure investment that deals with those uncertainties? And of course, there's a whole bunch of other things in a technological sense happening at the same time. You've got hyperloops, you've got Uber Elevates, you've got drones, you've got all sorts of things happening. We didn't look at that. This was a big enough deal as it was. So happy to talk about those things, but that wasn't really our focus. Nor was the automation of trains and trams, which of course is interesting, but has been done already in a number of locations. An important element of the way Infrastructure Victoria works is that we're very open and transparent and really interested in getting the evidence base right, and are conscious that often, particularly in something as uncertain as this, when it comes to automation, there are legitimately a range of views about what is going to happen. And so we did this work over a 12-month period, and that involved some distinct phases of consultation and release of evidence. So we kicked off our first few months by talking to lots of people in industry and government and academia about what are the key issues that arise for the deployment of automated and zero-emission vehicles. Then we used those key issues to build some scenarios, which I'll talk to you about in more detail shortly. And the development of those scenarios drove a whole bunch of technical studies that were then released for everybody to see and give us comments on, so that we could iterate and adjust before we gave our final report a year later. Which is this Pulitzer Prize winning work, which I recommend to you all. And there is, one copy here for a lucky question answerer. Asker, I should say. So I talked before about scenarios. So there is quite a degree of uncertainty that we face here. And you might even say, particularly in relation to automotive vehicles, some hype. Actually, quite a lot of hype and quite a lot of speculation. And so we were, in some of the earlier speakers, were talking about, well, how do you navigate this uncertainty? Because we're making investments that are going to last many decades. So what we did is we used a scenarios-based approach, which flowed through to the modelling approach we took as well. And again, bouncing off some of the earlier comments around models, really useful for giving a sense of what could be the outcomes be, what could be some decisions we need to make. Absolutely not useful for getting things 100% right. So what we didn't do is try to predict exactly what's going to happen, because we would have been exactly wrong. Instead, what we did is we picked scenarios that draw a box around the possibilities of what we think is going to happen, perhaps in the future, with the key issues and what everyone had told us, in the knowledge that actually the reality of what's going to happen is sometime inside that box, and that we've got a bunch of policy and investment choices to make to decide, a little bit at least, where in that box do we want to be. So let me describe these scenarios to you briefly. And if you have interest in these, there's an extremely cute video on our website that's animated that will also explain these, and a report as well. What we did is we started with the Electric Avenue scenario, which also happens to be a really irritating pop song from some decades ago, which I don't recommend to anybody. This is a scenario in which the entire Victorian vehicle fleet is battery electric vehicle. Okay, so as I said before, not necessarily realistic. It's an extreme that could occur but is unlikely to occur. But it gives us a sense of what are the implications of that. We're modelling and in 2046. So why are we modelling in 2046? For a few reasons. One is it is plausible that you'd have a really high penetration of automotive vehicles in the Victorian fleet then. Of electric vehicles in the Victorian fleet, and automotive vehicles too. It's also about the limit of where our transport models, our land use models, and our population projections are as well. And what we did is we built extensions to the Melbourne activity-based model, which IV developed with a number of consultancies that allow us to model on the road what these behaviours are. So this is a scenario where we're all still driving our vehicles, but they're all battery electric, and we own them. Second scenario is private drive. So that is, we privately own our own vehicles. They're battery electric, but they're highly automated. So take the steering wheel out. What does the automation at level 4 or 5 do? But they're privately owned. Let's change the market model now. So it's a fleet street. So instead of being privately owned, these battery electric automated vehicles, they're all on demand. No one is allowed to own their own vehicle under this scenario. So the way we get around is on-demand fleets or public transport, or we might even walk. And so this gives a sense of, well, what happens when that market model changes and you've got those on-demand fleets. Then we ripped out the battery and put in the hydrogen fuel cell for these automated vehicles. So that's hydrogen highway. So what this is really exploring is the very different energy implications that you have for making a hydrogen fleet work versus a battery electric fleet. Then we played around with the time a bit. So our slow lane scenario is a not implausible at all scenario where you have a mix of conventionally driven internal combustion vehicles, and then the other half of the fleet is these on-demand automated battery electric vehicles. How does that work out? How does the network perform? What does that mean for our energy requirements? The high-speed scenario is one where that on-demand automated fleet is so attractive that we all go, nah, I'm getting rid of the car, none of us own vehicles, and it happens really quickly, so in 2031. A discussion and an offer I've made to my wife to get rid of our vehicle, we're still under some discussions around that. It's probably fair to say. But what we're doing here is when you've got a less developed transport and energy network, how would we cope with a change happening that quickly? And finally, the dead-end scenario, which is, hey, what if all this automation, what if all this electrification just isn't the thing? What if technically we can't do it? What if, in terms of social licence, it's not acceptable? So it's really our base case that we compare everything against in 2046. And I guess something I'd point out to you is, because we've released all the modelling and stuff around this, regardless of whether you're interested in automation and electrification, the 2046 modelling is kind of interesting anyway, in terms of where Victoria and Melbourne in particular is going to be at that time. So, having developed these scenarios, we then commissioned a whole lot of technical studies about what are their implications. So, of course, as I said, we did lots of transport modelling. And this is quite innovative transport modelling using an activity-based model in Melbourne for the first time. And it models both the public transport network and the road network and active transport. And you can see the choices that people make between those modes. We did quite a lot of work on, well, what are the road engineering implications of this? You know, what are the lines and the signs and the pavement changes we need to make to enable, in particular, automated vehicles? What is the ICT support that is needed to enable particularly automated vehicles to function really well? But also we're looking at some of the costs and benefits. So what are the energy requirements, which are really end up being quite significant? There's a bit of a spoiler for you. What are the land use implications under these scenarios? The economic implications, and the environmental. So what we did was commission a study around the impacts of vehicle emissions on human health in a Melbourne context, which we're not aware of anyone having done, at least at this level, before, which really start to quantify what happens when you take those tailpipe emissions away. The other thing we did, of course, is visualise what some of the changes are. So what you can see here is Sturt Street in Ballarat, and it has been visualised with a mix of automated, which are the white vehicles, and non-automated, which are the colourful ones, including a nastily covered Subaru, which I do not endorse that colour. But what it's trying to do is give you a sense of, well, we've got strategic planning opportunities in terms of land use, but we've also got some streetscape changes that we can make that will really make a tangible difference, potentially, to our daily lives. So we quantified some really significant benefits under these scenarios. And the benefits I've got here before you are really at the top end of potential benefits. We don't necessarily get all of them, right, in real life. But somewhere inside the box, as I was describing earlier, there are some really significant benefits to be gained. So a couple of % GSP gain, potentially. Up to 91% of congestion reduced. Now, that is a really huge number, and that is if you have only on-demand automated fleets, which we don't think is realistic. But we think that what you get under every one of these scenarios, though, is a reduction in congestion against the base case. What we do is sometimes, that's whole of network performance. So what you do sometimes is get some little patches that aren't so great, and I'll show you those in a minute. A really significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can have the vehicle fleet go to zero emission at source and tailpipe, then about 25% contribution to Victoria's greenhouse gas reduction targets. About $700 million worth of health benefits each year, and most of that is from those avoided tailpipe emissions I was describing earlier, and up to 94% of road accidents reduced. Now, that's also at the top end of what you might hope to get. That's the contribution that human error makes to vehicle accidents. We think that you probably wouldn't get that much, but as you get some of the automated safety features coming into these vehicles, there's a lot up for grabs there. Doesn't all come for free though. We estimated about 1.7 billion up to in terms of mobile network upgrades that wouldn't happen otherwise. So when you look into the future, there's going to be really significant upgrades anyway that are already planned by telcos. This is filling in the gaps, often in a regional highway network, where there isn't that really high speed, high quality coverage that AVs will benefit from. About $250 million for improving line marking, so the lines and the signs that automated vehicles really need, especially during the next couple of decades of adoption as they start to wind up. And then at least $2.2 billion for energy network upgrades, and it could be more than that. I'll talk some more on that shortly. I want to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the evidence base that we've got here. And if you're interested in any of this, all those reports I described to you earlier, they're all on the IV website for you to enjoy in the pleasure of your own home. And we'd encourage you to use them and reapply them in any way that you would like to. So, since some of the transport modelling, so this is the fleet street scenario, so where you have only automated on-demand fleets, and it's comparing the change in flow as against the base case in the morning peak. And what you can see there is a far greater flow that you get, and let's contrast that to the network diagram that looks a little bit like a bloodshot eye, and you'd probably feel like that if you were trying to get into the CBD under this scenario. So this is where you have the private drive scenario. So we all own our own automated vehicles, and we can go into the CBD, and then because actually we don't really want to pay the parking charge, we'll just send it back home again. And these vehicles have got a very low cost per kilometre. So suddenly we've just absolutely maxed up the number of trips being taken. This is not very pretty, as you can see from the vehicle speeds. However, if you do what we and Marion and others have been talking about in terms of exploring a congestion cordon, a congestion charge around the CBD, which we did in one of the other modelling runs, that actually really clears up. So this is an example of where you can use modelling to get a sense of what are some of the policy solutions. Energy is a big deal under this future where you have electrification of the vehicle fleet. What you've got here is the demand, maximum demand that you're getting on the energy network under the private drive scenario, so where we've got battery electric automated privately owned vehicles, but you get a similar result just with electric vehicles. Forget about the automation, it's a pretty similar result. On the left-hand side, what you get is everybody coming home at the end of the day and plugging in and charging, where you don't have any price signal or other policy incentive to charge it any other time. So what have we just done? We've just stacked on demand of a time that there's already lots of demand. On the right-hand side is the load profile when you have a price signal, combined probably with a technical service offering that allows somebody else probably to take over the charging of your vehicle to flatten it out overnight. And that gets us a much flatter load profile, and the cost of that in terms of infrastructure is a couple of $2 billion. So again, this is an extreme scenario, right? Because I don't think it was necessarily exactly what the fleet's going to look like. But the point is we've got some policy changes and some investment changes to make in light of this. Just briefly to show you, I talked about some of the ICT investments that might be required. So this is the modelling and mapping we did of where additional ICT connectivity would be required, which is in the regional highway network. Now, so we had John talking about Monash freeway upgrades. I'm not sure if this is exactly the same spot, although it must be pretty close to where your picture was, just a little bit into the future. So you'll notice a few differences under this all-automated vehicle scenario on the Monash freeway. Firstly, the vehicles are moving very fast and very close together. So you do get one of the assumptions around the way AVs operate, which is a big promise and a big variable, a big assumption, is how close they move together and how rapidly they do that and what that contributes to reduction in congestion. But you're seeing that here. You're also seeing a greeny-blue line down the middle. So this is the dynamic flow that you can play with to maximise use of the asset depending on which way is the contraflow. You've got cyclists like me riding really close to it, and I'm not swearing about the diesel fumes because there aren't any. You've got greenery next to it as well because these things don't crash, so you can put the trees back. Now, we're not saying this is exactly how it's going to be, right? And you've got similar visualisations for some suburban streets, some shopping centres, other places. There's Chapel Street's always a popular one, which you can jump on our website and play with the cute sliders and see what the future may or may not hold. But rather to illustrate some of the benefits that we have up for grabs more tangibly. Stepping back for a moment, there's probably three big themes I'd like to highlight. What we've got going on here is convergence of the transport and energy sectors in a way that we're not really used to thinking about up to now. Of course, we think about big oil companies, but this is actually the convergence of the electricity sector and the transport sector. And as you can see from some of those network load diagrams, if we don't get that right, that could have significant implications for both sectors. We've also got convergence of the transport and the ICT sectors, which is happening already, and it's going to become more profound in terms of the need for connectivity. And you do start to get, under some of these scenarios, a blurring of what is public and what is private transport, and the ability for automated vehicles or on-demand vehicles to start to fill in some of the gaps that a public transport network has, but also, if we're not careful, it could cannibalise a public transport network in a way that doesn't give us good network outcomes. So there's some clear choices for us to make about what are the investment signals, the network access and the price signals to get that balance right. We made 17 recommendations to the Victorian Government across a whole range of areas, including actually, what do you do with the waste so that Niall and his crew in the future can know what to do with all these dead batteries. And for the next 3 hours, I'm going to go through every single one of those recommendations. If you're interested, please feel free to have a look. We've got limited time, but what I thought I might do is just hone in on one of these recommendations that we've got, which is around future-proofing projects, because I think that's kind of relevant to the discussions that have been had throughout the day. So there's a couple of things that come up here. One is simply an engineering thing, says I, the lawyer and historian, right? But even I can work out that under this level of uncertainty, you might want to leave some room to, have some empty conduits to put stuff in that you don't quite know what's going to be there yet. You probably also, in your business case, you might get a sense that actually your future demand for roads and other forms of infrastructure could significantly change, depending upon the rate at which these vehicles are taken up, who takes them up, and under which one of those business models they're taken up. Because whether you get an on-demand vehicle fleet or a whole lot of private ownership or it concentrated in different geographies or market sectors might make a big difference to, your toll road revenues perhaps, which are already, a pretty critical issue. So what we've been able to do through our work is at least explore some of those variables and some of the assumptions you might make and how big a difference those assumptions make to the way the network operates and what demand might look like. And so if you were planning out a project now, I'd be thinking about that if your project's going to be, operating in the transport sector for more than the next few years. There's lots of speculation about the rate at which these are going to be taken up. We think that certainly electrification is going to happen, and the rate at which it happens will be very much dependent on things like emissions standards, price parity, model availability, and it'll happen, probably in a patchy manner in terms of where it happens, in terms of the demographics and geography. And automation we could certainly see happening earlier in vehicle fleets, like on-demand vehicle fleets, in freight, and probably public transport as well. That, of course, is much more uncertain. But this is heading our way, and so it's certainly something worth thinking about in terms of project development. So I've got a bunch of other recommendations which I won't go over for the sake of time, but just to remind you that if you jump on our website, there's lots more there. And Dominic, if we've got a few minutes for questions, very happy to.